She lost everything at 74. That's when her real life began.
At 74, when most women her age were tending rose gardens and spoiling grandchildren, Eleanor Marsh found herself standing on a sidewalk with nothing but 2 worn suitcases and a marriage certificate that no longer meant anything to anyone. Her husband of 46 years, Richard Marsh, had been methodical about it, the kind of man who kept spreadsheets for everything, including, it turned out, the dismantling of a life they had built together. The house went to him, the savings account, the car, even the small investment fund she had once suggested opening, back when they still talked about the future as though it belonged to both of them. He took everything he could see. What he never thought to look for was the thing he couldn't. The afternoon Richard left was a Tuesday in late September. Eleanor remembered that detail clearly, not because of any particular significance, but because the garbage truck had come that morning, and she had thought, standing at the window watching it pull away, how strange that ordinary things continue on a day like this. The movers finished by 2 o'clock. Richard stood beside his car, a new one, she noticed, dark blue, still carrying that faint chemical smell of fresh upholstery, and reviewed the paperwork one last time as though checking items off a grocery list. The court was clear, he said, when she tried to speak. Everything was handled properly. Properly. That was the word he chose. Eleanor looked at the house behind him, the kitchen window where she had stood 10,000 mornings watching birds at the feeder. The front door she had painted herself, twice, in different shades of green over the years. The oak tree in the yard, whose lowest branch her daughter had fallen from at age 7, the scar still faint on her chin. Richard. There are very good assisted living communities, he said, without looking up from the folder. I had someone research the options. The one on Birchwood Lane has excellent reviews. She stared at him for a long time. He never once looked back. At the bottom of her handbag, beneath a folded handkerchief and an old loyalty card for a coffee shop that had closed 3 years ago, Eleanor's fingers found a key. Small, brass, worn almost smooth on one side from decades of being held. She sat on the curb after his car disappeared and turned it over in her palm. Her Aunt Clara's place. She hadn't thought of it in years, not really thought of it, the way you don't think about your own breathing. A small property tucked into the hills about 90 miles north, left to Eleanor in a handwritten will that had surprised everyone at the reading, including Eleanor herself. Clara had said only, "You were always the one who understood what things were actually for." Richard had never asked about it, not once in 46 years. Eleanor closed her fingers around the key and stood up. The property was harder to find than she expected. The road narrowed to gravel about 2 miles before the turnoff, and the last half-mile was barely a path at all, more like a suggestion made by the trees. The cottage sat in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pines. It was smaller than memory had made it, as places from childhood always are. The porch listed slightly to the left. Paint had peeled from the shutters in long, curling strips. A climbing rose, completely unpruned and magnificent in its wildness, had taken over most of the eastern wall. But the roof was solid. The chimney stood straight, and when Eleanor inserted the brass key into the lock, it turned on the second try, as though the house had simply been waiting for someone to remember it. Inside smelled of pine resin, dust, and something faintly sweet she couldn't immediately place. She stood in the doorway for a full minute before stepping in. Her Aunt Clara had been a particular kind of woman, the sort who believed that usefulness was its own form of beauty. The cottage reflected this completely. Nothing was decorative for decoration's sake. Everything had a purpose, and everything had been maintained with quiet, unhurried attention. In the kitchen, Eleanor found cast-iron pans hanging in order of size, a ceramic crock of wooden spoons, a shelf lined with hand-labeled jars, dried thyme, rosehip, lavender, elderflower. In the small pantry, a row of preserving books so old their spines had faded to illegibility. But inside, the pages were dense with handwritten annotations in Clara's small, precise script. "The secret to good jam," one margin note read, "is patience and honesty. If the fruit isn't ready, no amount of sugar will fix it." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and read until it was too dark to see. The first weeks were not easy. She had lived in centrally heated houses for so long that managing a wood-burning stove felt like learning a foreign language. She burned the first 4 batches of anything she attempted to cook. She pulled a muscle in her lower back, clearing the garden beds, and spent 2 days moving very slowly and swearing under her breath. But she kept going. Every morning she lit the fire, made tea, and opened one of Clara's notebooks. Every afternoon she worked in the garden or in the kitchen. Every evening she wrote in her own notebook, a plain one she had bought in town on her first supply run, recording what she had learned, what had failed, what to try differently. By the 6th week, the garden beds were cleared and planted with winter greens, garlic, and the hardy herbs that Clara's notes recommended for this particular soil. By the 8th week, Eleanor's bread no longer came out dense and apologetic. It came out the way bread is supposed to, golden, fragrant, with a crust that shattered slightly when you tapped it. She made her first batch of apple butter on a Thursday afternoon in November, following Clara's recipe exactly, adjusting only for the size of her current harvest. She stood over the pot for 2 hours, stirring slowly, watching the colour deepen from pale yellow to amber to something that glowed in the low kitchen light like concentrated autumn. She labelled the jars herself, in handwriting that surprised her with its steadiness. Word travels differently in small communities than in cities. In cities, information moves fast and loud, announced and promoted. In the hills, it moves the way water moves through soil, slowly, quietly, but it gets everywhere. The first person to stop at the small table Eleanor set up near the road was a man in a work truck who slowed down mostly out of curiosity, bought a jar of apple butter, and told her it was the best thing he'd tasted since his grandmother died. The second was a woman who ran the post office in the nearest town, who bought 2 loaves of bread and came back the following week with her sister. Within 2 months, Eleanor had a small but reliable stream of customers. People who took slightly out-of-their-way routes, people who planned their drives to pass the cottage on Fridays when the bread was fresh, people who asked whether she might consider making rosehip syrup because they'd heard it was good for winter colds. She began keeping a ledger, not because the amounts were large, they weren't, not at first, but because Clara's notes had been clear on this point. Track everything, not for greed, but for understanding. A thing you don't measure, you can't improve. She improved. By the following summer, the cottage had become something else. Not a destination exactly. It was still too remote and too modest for that word. More like a landmark. A place people mentioned when giving directions. Turn left just past the cottage where the woman sells the jam. A place people referenced when recommending gifts. Get her the apple butter from the lady up in the hills. She'll love it. Eleanor hired a teenager from town 2 afternoons a week to help in the garden. She expanded the preserving operation to include 3 varieties of jam, 2 types of dried herb bundles, elderflower cordial in summer, and rosehip syrup in autumn and winter. She began supplying a small restaurant in town that prided itself on sourcing locally and had been looking for exactly this kind of thing. The ledger grew thicker. The cottage grew more itself. Eleanor grew, quietly and without announcement, into someone she had always been but had never had quite enough room to become. Richard arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. Eleanor was at the outdoor table, writing new labels, when she heard the engine. She recognized the sound before she saw the car, that particular expensive quietness that had always struck her as a kind of statement. He parked at the edge of the clearing, and stepped out slowly. He looked older than she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd expected. Smaller, maybe. He had always seemed to take up a particular kind of space, not physically, but atmospherically, the way certain people make rooms arrange themselves around them. Standing at the edge of her clearing, he just looked like a man in a good coat who had driven a long way and wasn't sure why. Eleanor. She set down her pen, did not stand. Richard. He looked around the clearing slowly, the way people do when they're trying to understand something they hadn't prepared to understand. The garden, the drying herbs hanging under the porch roof, the table with its rows of labelled jars, the repaired porch railing, the sign near the road, hand-lettered and weathered now, and somehow more authoritative for it. He looked at all of it for a long time before he spoke again. I heard about this place. I imagine you did. I wasn't sure it was you at first. He paused. Then I was sure it was, and I wasn't sure what to do about that. Eleanor reached for the jar she'd been labelling and completed the date before responding. What did you decide? To come. He moved a few steps closer, but stopped well short of the porch steps, as though some boundary there was visible only to him. I thought we might talk. We talked through lawyers for 4 months. That wasn't talking. He said it quietly, without argument. That was just processing, dividing things. I've been thinking about it differently lately. Have you? He looked at the cottage, at the window boxes she'd planted in June with trailing herbs that had now grown lush and overflowed their containers, at the stack of empty jars waiting to be filled. The house sold, he said. It needed more work than I thought. The costs were… He stopped himself. I didn't come to talk about that. And yet you began with it. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. The afternoon was warm and still. Somewhere behind the cottage, a woodpecker was working methodically at a dead pine. Eleanor waited. I thought I was being practical, Richard said finally. I thought assets, legal arrangements, clean division. I thought I was handling it the responsible way. He paused. I never asked about this place. No. I didn't know it existed. You knew my aunt left me property. You were at the reading. A longer pause. I didn't think it was worth anything. Eleanor looked at him steadily. I know. He flinched slightly at that. I thought, he continued, slowly now, as though finding the words as he went, that I was walking away with everything that mattered. I thought everything that mattered was the kind of thing that could be put in a file, named, numbered, divided. He looked around the clearing again. I was wrong about that. Yes. You've built something here. I continued something that was already here. There's a difference. He nodded slowly, as though this distinction meant more to him than it might have a year ago. People in town talk about you. Not with pity. Not as a story about someone who fell on hard times. They talk about you the way people talk about something they're glad exists. He stopped. I hadn't expected that. What had you expected? He was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, he said, I expected you to have needed help. From relatives or from somewhere. I expected to hear that you were managing, but barely. I expected to feel… He stopped again. Justified, Eleanor offered. He didn't deny it. The woodpecker paused, then resumed. I came to ask, Richard said, his voice dropping slightly, whether there was anything… I don't know, whether there was any part of things that could be different between us. Whether I could… No. He looked up. Not because I want to hurt you, Eleanor said, because it's simply true. You made a decision about what our life was worth and what I was worth, and you were thorough about it. People usually only get to make that decision once. He nodded. Something in his posture changed. Not collapsed exactly, but released, as though he had been holding a shape that no longer served any purpose and had finally set it down. "I see that," he said. "I know you do. I think that's why you drove 90 miles on a Wednesday." A faint sound that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. It didn't become one. "You're different," he said. Eleanor considered this. "I'm exactly who I always was. There's just nobody here requiring me to be less of it." Richard stood in the clearing for another minute. The light was shifting, the long afternoon shadows beginning to cross the garden beds. He looked at the cottage one final time, at the whole of it, as though committing it to memory for reasons he might not yet fully understand. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor," he said. She met his eyes. "I will." He walked back to his car. Didn't rush. The engine started with that familiar quiet. The car moved slowly back down the path between the trees, and the sound of it faded until there was nothing left but the woodpecker and the wind, and the ordinary, sufficient sounds of her life continuing. Eleanor picked up her pen, wrote the date on the next label, reached for the next jar. There are things that can be taken: houses, accounts, years, even a particular version of who you thought you were. And there are things that cannot. The knowledge built quietly over a lifetime, the ability to make something from almost nothing, the memory of a brass key in a handbag, the understanding that useful and beautiful have always been the same word. Richard Marsh drove away that Wednesday, believing he had lost something he never quite had. Eleanor Marsh pressed the label onto the jar, set it in line with the others, and went inside to start the next batch. The road outside the cottage was empty and peaceful. The garden needed watering in the morning. There was, as always, more to do.
You can take the house, you can take the money, you can take the ears, but you will never take what someone had to become just to survive. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like, so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Bye bye.